Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about how to improve your DPS on any class in Mythic Plus. One of the most common questions I get from newer players is how to increase their damage. Most of the time, they've already done their research, they're using solid builds, and they have a decent understanding of their rotation, but for some reason their DPS still feels lower than it should be. And while there's always room for mechanical improvement, the answer, believe it or not, is usually a lot simpler than most people think. The difference between lower performing and higher performing Mythic Plus players often isn't about what buttons they're pressing, but rather when they're pressing them. Now that is an incredibly simplified explanation as the difference between lower and higher rated players, but this video is going to be talking about specifically cooldowns. There is a really common misconception that newer players fall into when they first start running keys, and it usually comes from good intentions. The idea is that the best way to do damage is to get the maximum value out of one really good cooldown window. So they hold their cooldowns, wait for the tank to gather things up, and then dump everything when it finally looks right. And to be fair, that logic isn't technically wrong, but it's also not that simple. What actually ends up happening here is players overly focus on waiting for that ideal pull, and while they're waiting, their cooldowns are just sat there doing nothing. They sit there off cooldown, pull after pull, because the next one is almost good enough, or the tank is about to grab more, or surely the real pull is about to come up soon. Over the course of the dungeon, that is where a lot of damage just quietly disappears for newer players. At the end of the day, dungeons aren't about one great big burst window, they are about consistent damage from start to finish. If holding your cooldowns for that perfect pull means you lose 1 or 2 extra uses of it later on, the trade is almost never worth it, even if the one pull you saved them for felt really good. In real runs, especially in pugs, the perfect pull usually just never shows up. Tanks fluctuate constantly with different routing, and the dungeon just doesn't flow consistently, making planning near impossible. So inexperienced players end up in this pattern where they keep telling themselves, okay, the next pull I'll use my cooldowns for sure, and then the next pull isn't quite right either. None of these individual moments or hesitations feel like a big mistake on their own, but when they're stacked together, they add up really quickly. If you hold a cooldown for an extra minute because you're waiting for a better opportunity, that sounds harmless at face value. But if that happens repeatedly over the course of a dungeon, you can easily end up sitting on your strongest buttons for 8 or more total minutes. Depending on your cooldowns, that means missing anywhere from 3 to 10, and sometimes even more full uses in a single dungeon run. And that's why this habit is so punishing. You remember the pulls where everything lined up perfectly and your damage spiked up into great heights, but you don't see all the damage you're losing just waiting to send your cooldowns. And when the dungeon finally ends, it feels like something just didn't click, not because you necessarily played badly, but because your cooldown spent more time waiting instead of working. But how do you fix that? Honestly, it's a lot simpler than most people would expect, even though it feels incredibly wrong and counterintuitive at first. You need to shift your mindset away from this perfect cooldown usage because that's a pipe dream, and more so focus on using your cooldowns as early as often as possible. When making this change in mindset, the priority isn't about squeezing out maximum value, it's about breaking the habit of hesitation. For newer players, cooldowns feel like something you need to justify before pressing them. The problem with that mindset is that it keeps you from ever getting comfortable actually using them. Instead, you kind of want to flip that logic on its head. If your cooldown is available and the pull is going to live long enough for your whole cooldown window, just press them. Even if it's not the ideal pull and your body is telling you to wait, using the cooldown now starts the timer again, and that's what matters when you're breaking this habit of holding. And this is where it's important to be honest about expectations, because breaking this habit doesn't happen overnight. For most players, it takes anywhere from a week to a month to really force this new mindset, depending upon how often you're playing the game. For me, personally, it took about 2 weeks before it really clicked, and that was with me playing an unhealthy amount. At first, using my cooldowns felt wrong, but once I pushed through that phase and just committed to pressing them, everything just started to feel more natural. That's also why it's completely fine to use your cooldowns in less than ideal situations during this testing phase. In fact, that's kind of the point. You're training yourself to treat your cooldowns as part of your normal rotation and not special buttons you only press a few times during a dungeon. Your precision training can always come later. But to be clear, yes, there are obviously ideal moments to use your cooldowns, but that level of optimization only works once you're really comfortable hitting your cooldowns in the first place. If you skip straight to trying to be perfect, you usually end right back up where you started. Like I said earlier, you think about this phase like you're building a habit of prioritizing reps over precision. That's how you build your consistency, and that consistency is what actually raises your overall damage. Once that feels natural, then you can start worrying about the ideal pulls, dungeon pacing, and squeezing out extra value. But you don't get there by waiting, you get there by pressing the button. Even though this breaking the habit phase feels innately wrong, you're actually learning a lot more about your class without even realizing it. You start to get a feel for how much damage you can realistically pump out during that window, and how quickly that damage falls off once things start dying or mechanics take over. You also start to see what pull sizes are ideal for you to do the best damage, and which ones are less than ideal. The more you use your cooldowns, the more you'll start to notice patterns in everything. By pressing your buttons more, you're getting more experience in your actual cooldown window, allowing you to learn more about your class just overall. And that's the kind of improvement that you can't really learn from a guide. You only learn it by pressing your cooldowns, seeing what happens, and mentally logging the result. Even if you don't think you'll remember it, you will. You'll start to recognize the situations where holding your cooldowns briefly is actually the correct decision. Maybe the tank was pulling into something bigger, or maybe the boss is next and you know the cooldowns won't be up in time. The difference at this point is now you know why you're holding your cooldown. You're not hesitating because you're scared of wasting it, you're making a conscious decision based on your experience. You've seen how your class performs in different situations, you understand what kind of pulls let you do real damage, and you're choosing to hold it because it genuinely leads to more value later on, not because you're defaulting to caution. And that's when your cooldown usage stops feeling stressful or random and more purposeful. And once you get to that point, your damage doesn't just spike in certain moments, it starts to make sense across the entire run. But to wrap this all up, if there is one thing newer players should take away from this video, it's this. Stop being afraid of your cooldown buttons and just press them. If they're up, click that button. Break the habit of holding things just in case and start forcing yourself to learn what actually works and what doesn't work. That learning can only happen when you're using your cooldowns, not when they're sitting there unused. Once you do that, I promise you your damage will get better. And once you're comfortable, you can then start the long, tedious process of optimization. But for now, don't overthink it. Just click some buttons and have fun blasting while you can, because there is always efficiency later on. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments below what class you're playing, or if you're guilty of holding your cooldowns too. Because honestly, we've all been there. I get it. But that's all I have for today, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.